Moving along and ahead, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tishner. Dr. Tishner has been working for us for a little over a year. Many of you have met him via Zoom, via some of our professional development that we had obviously in February of last year, actually of 2021, but last school year. We're finally getting to meet him in person, so that's kind of neat and fun as well. But we're excited about the presenters that our team has put together and the work of Dr. Tishner, and so I'm going to turn it over to him for some comments and a kickoff of today's activities. So Dr. Tishner, come on up.
Oh, thank you, Ron. I think my volume is on. You guys hear me okay? First, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I was told to make sure that I move around in the light because there's a shadow, but I move anyway, so that works. I imagine that as you enter into today, you have some feelings around what to expect. What is my emotional level? I'm returning back to school after being dealing with COVID for a year. I have a lot of other things that I need to be worried about, thinking about, and considering. I'm entering into a space with new colleagues or old colleagues that I haven't seen in a year. And so we're going to talk about this topic that may be difficult, and I have some anxiety about that. It's going to be a long day, and a lot of people might have some reactions to the conversations and the content. And ultimately, it might make me uncomfortable, and so I need to prepare myself for that, but I'm not really willing or ready to do that yet because there's some other things that I want to do. Earlier this week, I was writing the talk and trying to think about what do I want to say, what do I want to talk about, and I will be honest, I struggled all the way up until this morning to probably about 10 minutes ago and exactly how I want to talk. Like, I set up a PowerPoint and it was all ready to go, but my spirit, my mind, my heart wasn't really connected to the way that I structured the conversation because I wasn't sure what energy to give you, right? Did I need to inspire, right? Be excitable, right? Ready and gearing you for this conversation so that you can choose to engage because I need to persuade you to do it? Or do I need to be heartfelt, connected, because you already know why this is important and I just need to remind you of why we need to set the tone this year in a way that makes a lot of sense? Or do I need to be argumentative for those who may be on the other side of the conversation, trying to help you see this is valuable and critical and essential to any school district, but especially schools that believe that they care and support all students regardless of their background, as well as staff, regardless of their background. And honestly, I'm still figuring out what exactly I want to do. You could turn the volume down just a little. So today we want to talk about connecting our ideas to who we say we are and who we desire to be, and what that actually looks like, and then what is the work required of all of us in order to accomplish that. So that tone might be inspirational, depends on your perspective. It might be persuasive, depends on your perspective. And it might be completely contrary to what you believe. But what I want to ask you to do, and Rick set this up, is to be curious about what is it that I might need to do more of in order to ensure that every one of my students and my colleagues feel psychologically, emotionally, and physically safe. When we see the word safety, we often think about physical safety, and we say that's checked off because there's no violence in our community, at least perceptive violence. There's no physical violence. Ron says your fights are down to a significant level, and so there must not be any issue of safety in our community. But there's an issue of psychological and emotional safety that we always need to be aware of across any demographic, across any school district, across any environment. And the issue requires us to be mindful of how people experience us and the environment that we share together. So Mason, as a school district, highlights these ideas that we want to have a safe environment, one that engages in critical thinking, that is empowering students to succeed, and that is encouraged to serve the community. The diversity mission statement highlights these ideas, and I want to give you an opportunity to really highlight those ones in the red. The authentic learning opportunities that are inclusive and that highlight the connection to value. the connection to value, students, value, the value of others, the value of shared perspective, the value of community, the value of being able to connect, to grow, to learn, and to be challenged while also being cared for. Part of our process over the last year is to really set the tone for this work. And what we've done to do that is really started with shared understanding. And that's what today is going to be about, shared understanding. Before we can move into developing a plan and developing an articulated plan and then connecting it to the strategic plan and ultimately implementing and evaluating, we have to have shared language. And so our goal today is to have some shared language. And I'm going to start with your state in their definition of some of these concepts. So MDE provides a definition of school climate that is highlighted this way. And you'll see a lot of highlighted words that I think are critical, and I want to constantly prime you on these concepts that are important for us as we walk through today's learning and tomorrow's learning, but more importantly, as we move into this work over the next several months and several years. Safe, as I mentioned, psychological and emotional. When you hear me say safe, assume I'm speaking about psychological and emotional safety. Welcoming. Welcoming. Is the environment welcoming? Not to the extent that I believe I'm welcoming, but to the extent that the audience, the person who's entering my space, feels welcomed. Connected. What does it mean to be connected? To connect to an individual, to allow an individual to feel that he or she is connected to me. Relationships. This is a word that educational institutions use often. And I think it's overused at some level because there's an assumption that we actually know how to build them. We know how to build relationships. So we just say, it's all about relationships, it's all about relationships, it's all about relationships. But what does it mean to build them? What vulnerability must I have in order to engage with you? How do I show up in the context of that space when we're developing a relationship? And what is my responsibility to you? And then how do I sustain it? Relationships. And then conditions for learning. When I see conditions of learning, I think about also conditions for teaching. And there are certainly conditions for teaching that create the circumstance for learning to occur. What is the psychological and emotional safety of me as the educator, as the leader of my school community? And then how does that translate to me being able to create those same conditions for students? So I'll invite you to think about, am I safe psychologically and emotionally as a leader, as a teacher, as a staff member, as an individual contributor, adult to this school community? And if I am safe, how do I translate that safety to the students I serve, the community I serve, the families I serve? If I'm not safe, why am I not safe? Why am I not safe? And whose responsibility is it for me to be safe? Again, psychologically and emotionally safe. Whose responsibility is it for me to be safe? MDE defines diversity this way, and I'm not going to read it to you, but I'll highlight the concept that I really want you to be mindful of. Multiple factors, characteristics, and experiences. There's a glaring argument when you see the word diversity. People say, well, that's divisive in tone and in nature. My heart struggles with that statement in a lot of ways, primarily because the idea of diversity is the opposite of assimilation, is the opposite of having to be confined to a space that is not representative of all you are and all you desire to be in this world. So diversity is the appreciation of the uniqueness of individuals and their lived experiences. To be anti-diversity is to be anti-people's lived experiences. And there is no way to be a community without valuing, bring that word up again, the lived experiences of everyone that makes up that community. You'll hear me talk about that again. So I want to highlight it's multiple factors, multiple experiences, multiple characteristics. That is diversity to be celebrated. Equity. You guys who were here in February, we talked a lot about equity with our 2 keynotes during that virtual conversation. And the idea of equity is really being able to identify where the gaps are and then essentially shoring up those gaps so those that are marginalized are no longer marginalized, whatever category they represent. It is fairness in systems, recognizing that we are the people who contribute to the system. Connected, we ultimately can perpetuate or challenge the status quo so that we can have fairness in that system. Who defines fairness, though? Opportunities. Concepts like opportunity gaps, receivement gaps come to mind instead of achievement gaps. You know, the language is, instead of the student being responsible for their gap, I, the teacher, I, the system, am responsible for ensuring that there are increased opportunities and that there are increased opportunities for achievement. I become the responsible party in collaboration with the student. Opportunities. Eliminating barriers. It is the need to think about what are the present barriers and what am I responsible to do in order to interrogate, challenge, and then reduce said barriers. What does that mean? Prevent, and then to increase full participation for all individuals. What does it mean to have full participation? Important question that I want you to think about as you engage today. And then inclusion. Inclusion. The sense of respect, belonging, safety, attention to individual needs and identities. Not easy work, but essential work. And we'll talk about why, and you'll hear it a lot today. So I want to kind of frame the rest of this conversation with this question, and I'll give you a chance to read it. And this question came to me probably about 3 weeks ago, and I was, again, as I said earlier, thinking about how do I want to frame this conversation. And I think this question is the way that I want us to think about this conversation. How does Mason feel to the uninitiated? You say, what does uninitiated mean? I won't answer that for you. I want you to think about what does it mean to be uninitiated. Any time where you've been in a space, in a community, an environment where you were entering for the first time. The environment was or was not conducive to your readiness to be comfortable. The environment was or was not supportive of your uniqueness as an individual. The environment was or was not reflective of who you are. The environment was or was not supportive of your thoughts, of your lived experience, of your contribution to the world prior to entering into the space, where the environment was or was not set up for your success. Were you ever uninitiated? What is Mason Public Schools to the uninitiated, to the student, to the family who has not learned the rules of Mason, the rules? There are formal rules, there are informal rules. We exist in a space where policies are very clear. We have administrative guidelines generally articulated, but there's these informal rules, the lunchroom expectations, where you sit in the lunchroom, if you're an athlete or if you're a Gothic student, if you are an adult teacher and you are heterosexual versus lesbian, gay. What are the informal rules, and how do I experience that as I try to be initiated? Do I put on? Do I take off? And then how does that show up for my students? We know that the end user in education is the student and their education, right? Their experience being educated so that they can contribute to, I say, a diverse world. You fill in the blanks however you believe is important. For a Mason student, we are creating students that can contribute to a diverse world. Or are we creating students that contribute to the status quo? Or are we creating students that become independent so that they can do well for themselves but are not community oriented? Or are we creating students that have a global mindset and a local impact? You fill in the blanks, but for me, I say, I want to create students who can contribute to a diverse world. If diversity is not divisive, then the students and their development in understanding the diverse world is critical for them to understand how they can show up within, how can they identify themselves, how can they identify others, and then how they can establish community. I'll ask you to think about your answer to this question. How does Mason's Public Schools feel, again, to the uninitiated? So here's some key ideas that I just want to share for us to just think about throughout today, tomorrow, but beyond this moment. Policies and practices are situated within communities. What does that mean? That means that we, the people, get to dictate the translation of that policy and practice depending on the context that we are in. Schools are microcosms of larger society. Is Mason a microcosm of larger society? And if it is not, what does it need to do to become a microcosm of large society so that we are growing and learning together so that we can be a part of a diverse world where everyone has psychological and emotional safety? Privilege allows us to choose when to engage. So any of you who might be kind of nodding off of your head at the moment or not exactly listening because there's other priorities in your mind, I say to you, I can't do that. I can't do that because my mere existence means that I'm always mindful of what's true and not true for myself in relationship to others. As I drove down the street, Okemos Road, I began to experience a visceral reaction in preparation for the day, but not because I was the keynote, but because the environment was or was not conducive to my experience and my lived experience and my perception of my lived experience. So I had to put on or take off. I won't tell you what I actually did, but it's important for you to understand that that is often the experience of all of us as we enter into new spaces, especially when we are uninitiated. But I charge you to think about, what does it mean to be uninitiated? To be initiated, does that mean that I am forced to assimilate, or do I get to be myself, understand how that operates in the context of a shared community, and then celebrate it for my uniqueness and the contribution that I have in that shared community? Important to think about. Difference is often marginalized through censorship and a lack of openness to discuss topics. When I choose to be silent and I have the power, I have just said, this is not important. Or I'm uncomfortable with that, so that your position is invariably invalidated. But is that community? We must recognize how systems work together to perpetuate social injustice. If we do not educate ourselves, our students, on these issues, we perpetuate that status quo. So for the next 8 minutes, I'm just going to give you quotes to think about, and I'll speak to each of them as we close this beginning of our day. According to Jennifer Eberhardt, she says this toward the end of her book, Biased. Disparities are the raw material from which we construct the narratives that justify the presence of inequality. Disparities. So I'll ask you, what are disparities to you? What are the gaps present? And what is our responsibility? First, identifying those gaps, those disparities, and then second, figuring out why they exist, and then third, targeting them so they no longer exist, both systemically and individually. Avoidance represents an act of privilege. So when you find yourself avoiding anything, it is because you can, which represents privilege. And so it's important for us to think about, what privilege do I have? I'm an upwardly mobile, educated black man. I have privilege. I know it. I'm aware of it. I'm also heterosexual. I know it. I'm a Christian. I see my privilege. I have ableism. I can walk. I can move. I don't have to manage my life around my challenges physically, cognitively, intellectually. Privilege. We all have privilege. If I choose to avoid the conversation, those are moments when my privilege is showing up more than my understanding and empathy for whatever that topic might be. Equity cannot exist without cultural responsiveness. So we talked about what equity is. Now let's talk about what cultural responsiveness is. It's my ability to be able to understand empathically the experiences of others and then shift the way that I connect and engage so that they are more comfortable. Not me, so that they are more comfortable. And then my shift helps them then engage without psychological and emotional lack of safety. So that in the instance where they're present with me, they can now choose to learn freely. Choose to learn freely. There are many research studies, books that talk about students' choice not to learn from me, from you. Part of this is because they lack the cultural responsiveness from the educator to create the conditions for learning that supports their ability to be free, emotionally, psychologically free. And equity is not enough, right? So the topic we're covering is diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I want you to remember and think about is as you think about DEI, you also think about what does it mean to belong? Do I belong? Do I belong because of some unearned privilege? Do I belong because of earned privilege? Do I belong just by the sheer nature that I represent the majority and I have been able to assimilate so that my difference is not seen, heard, and as a result, I can just be present and be common? Or do I shift so that every individual, because of their individual lived experiences, is appreciated, respected, has a sense of safety and belongingness so that they have the same freedom that I experience if I have it? And what is my social responsibility to do that? If ever you've experienced being marginalized, you tend to have empathy more easily toward those who are marginalized. But in the instance where we have not been marginalized, it might be a bit harder to understand their plight. Think about marginalization on the basis of gender, if ever you've been passed up for a position because from your perspective it was based on gender. Economic status, if ever you were not invited to a room because somehow you did not represent that economic status. Yesterday I was in Detroit and Jalen Rose, the ex-basketball player, did a golf event, and he was doing a fundraiser at a bar, and then he had the golf event today. And I walked in and I had to ask myself the question, do I belong economically in this room? What does it mean for me to feel marginalized as a result of what I can and cannot do? What's perceived and non-perceived, what's informal and formal for me. We have to develop a connection to anyone who experienced marginalization through empathy, not sympathy. It's not the idea that we look down and feel sorry for, but instead we walk alongside, understand, connect, and then create the space for that marginalization to no longer be true. What does that mean for me? And it requires us to really invest in this idea of what are our blind spots, our biases, what contributes to our ability or inability to see. Is it privilege? Is it choice? Is it ignorance? Is it apathy? Am I afraid? Why am I afraid? And who is suffering as a result of my positioning, depending on that? Important for us to think about. The statement here is that it is a social agenda that we have to all engage in. It's a moral stance. Every society has disadvantaged groups based on bias. If we don't interrogate bias and recognize that we have control over it, ultimately it will constantly replicate itself. And so what I want us to think about is these ideas that connect back to what our mission statement is. You see the word critical. Justice is not listed there, but it's inherent in any work that educators do. If you understand that your work is about freedom, emotional, psychological, intellectual freedom to contribute to a diverse world, and equity to shore up the gaps after identifying where they are in the system, in my efforts as an educator across the entire school district, regardless of my role, and then how do I collaborate to reduce those gaps so that every student has psychological and emotional safety. But it's not limited to the student. It is also my colleagues. What is my responsibility to create that? A critical lens helps us to see and then interrogate and then evaluate and then challenge and then replicate or to transform or to destroy as needed. Sometimes we have to break things to fix them better, but we first have to see the problem and the outcomes of those problems. That requires a critical lens. If you're not critically conscious, then you will fall in the trap of accepting the status quo. What does it mean to be critical? Important for you to think about today. And then justice. Who is experiencing injustice as a result of who they are, their identity, their lived experiences, and how they show up in the world? That cuts across any demographic topic, right? You might assume that as a black man, I'm gonna talk about race. Absolutely, but not right now, because there are other issues that experience injustice. There are other communities that experience injustice. What I'm doing is saying we are responsible to identify the injustice and then identify where we fit. Are we status quo, or are we critically conscious? Are we maintaining, or are we shifting? Are we always learning, or have we already learned? Have we already learned? The idea of competence is something that I always have struggled with. It assumes that we've made it to an endpoint. This work is life work. So if you've been in here, applaud you for 40 years of this work, 30 years of this work, 15, 10, congratulations, the work continues. Because for us to create the world that is needed for every student and staff to be psychologically and emotionally safe, we have to always be learning. But first, about ourselves. Then second, about why we are the way we are. Third, how does that contribute to the society? And fourth, how does that affect others? And I want to end with this statement. Mason is a community. Mason Public Schools, microcosm of that community. It is okay to be present around shared experiences, a shared identity. We are Mason. Mason as a macro system, however, is made up of micro individuals. You can't have a macro system without a bunch of micro systems contributing to the macro. What does it mean to appreciate the micro of every individual that contributes to that macro? It's not assimilation. There's a concept called acculturation that challenges assimilationism. It says that we have the ability to move between cultures, subcultures, without losing any part of ourselves. I choose how I show up, but in all spaces, I am comfortable to do so. So do we require assimilation where you become Mason, but you have to strip all of who you are in order to be present and successful? Or do you get to bring all of who you are and still get to be present and successful? See, I said still get to be. Let's change the language. Because of who you are, you will be. Because of your uniqueness, because of who you are, because of your lived experience. We will create the condition for you to be physically, that's easy, psychologically, maybe harder, emotionally safe. As an educator, as a leader, as a bus driver, as a lunch staff, as a student. It is easy for a non-diverse community to argue they have no diversity issues. That is untrue. We are all individually incredibly diverse. The challenge is that we've been asked to assimilate too many times to the extent that we don't even know what makes us unique. When we are at a point where everyone can exist uniquely, we would have accomplished part of this work. Then We move into creating the space where all students can now achieve because they feel like they have representation in their work, in their materials, and they can be who they are without having to feel the need to assimilate. And it's also true for every adult in our school community. You could argue that that's what America was founded on. Some people argue. The ability to be free and be who you are. But is that true here in Mason? We have to ask ourselves that question. And it starts with us identifying the shared story and the individual stories of every person. Again, I said it's not easy work for us to be able to accept and acknowledge the stories of each person that show up in our room, in our environment, but it's critical because in understanding their stories, we can then empathize, we can then celebrate and appreciate, and we then become transformed. That requires us to understand that there are stories that are told that may not represent the lived experiences of everyone. So how do we create the space for all lived experiences to be privileged? We're not giving voice to people. What we're doing is giving our ears to the story. I have voice. You don't have to give it to me. No student needs you to give them voice. You need to give them ears, listening, space to communicate. Same with staff. So I just want you to think about that as you move into the day. These will be the categories that you will focus on as I close. Conditions for teaching and learning, culture and climate, student experiences, and our instructional practices. The lens by which we do this work contributes to the status quo or to creating the space where everyone, person, adult, student, community member, consultant, presenter, feels psychologically and emotionally safe to be here. That requires us to create those conditions all the time. And so what I want you to do is just be reflective today. As Rick said, be curious, be a learner. Don't feel guilt. Translate that to energy around what must I do to be better. The presenters will facilitate great discussion, but the work is yours. They facilitate learning. And when we talk about creating independent learners, that is facilitating learning, not controlling the learning, facilitating it. And so your presenters will facilitate your learning, but you have to choose to be present in it. You can disengage, status quo, or you can be critically conscious. Once you are critically conscious and you make that choice, change is imminent, but it's up to you to choose that. And so at this time, I want to end my comments by saying thank you for what you will do, not today and tomorrow, but for the rest of this work. It's going to be hard. But when you do it, it becomes easier because it's a part of who you choose to be. Always present, always in you. So I thank you for your attention this morning, and I ask you to be mindful of your investment moving forward. For all of you who have been incredibly engaged in this work, please keep it going. Me saying that it's learning and life learning, you already know that. For you who are new to this idea, I'll ask you to consider how might it need to be life learning experiences so that I create those conditions. Thank you.